Good afternoon, everyone. I'm delighted to welcome you to Making Me Too Count, Achieving Institutional Change at Harvard. My name is Sophie Hill. I'm a PhD student here in the Government Department at Harvard. I'm part of a team of grad students here who are co-hosting this event alongside our wonderful graduate student union, HGSU-UAW. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that this is a difficult conversation. Many of you are probably here because your own lives have been affected in some way by sexual violence. And so I want to say, if you need to step outside the room and take a breath, you're absolutely welcome to do so. We have a list of handouts with national and local resources just on the tables outside. Please take one if you'd like. We're also lucky to have Rose Puyo from OSAPA. She's just there, giving us a wave. OSAPA is the Harvard Office of Sexual Assault Prevention and Response, and they offer confidential support to members of the Harvard community, and so please do use Rose as a point person to get connected. So as we've been putting this event together, I've been thinking about something that our Congresswoman, Ayanna Pressley, has said, that the people closest to the pain should be closest to the power. And too often when it comes to cases of harassment and discrimination, Harvard has done the exact opposite. It has pushed aside and ignored the people closest to the pain. And those who caused the pain were given even more power. So in a small way, I think this event is our attempt to begin to rectify that. So for our first panel, we are really honored to welcome Karl, Charna, Sherman, Suzanna, Challen, and Nienke Grossman back to the Government Department. These four women, alongside many others, came forward 2 years ago to share their experiences of harassment at Harvard. And they're here today to talk about why they're still in this fight. After that, we'll transition to our second panel on achieving institutional change. And we're so pleased to welcome a very distinguished guest, Debra Katz. She's a founding partner of Katz, Marshall & Banks, a DC law firm, and has often been called America's top Me Too lawyer, recently representing Christine Blasey Ford and Vanessa Tyson. Another distinguished guest is our very own Sejal Singh, who is a student at Harvard Law School, an activist, a co-founder of the People's Parity Project, and a union organizer. So after we've heard from all of our panelists, we'll open it up to Q&A, and we look forward to a really interesting discussion. And with that, I'll hand it over to our first panelists.
All right. Well, first of all, thank you to Sophie Hill and the Harvard Government Graduate Student Association Diversity Working Group for the opportunity to participate in this event today. And thank you to all of you for being here. It means a lot to us that you're here. So we're not here today because Jorge Dominguez engaged in unwelcome advances or sexual harassment of at least 18 female staff, graduate, undergraduate students, and faculty for 40 years. We're here today because Harvard tolerated it, turned a blind eye to it, willfully ignored it, and promoted him anyway, because it exiled Karl and kept Jorge Dominguez. The amount of harm inflicted on staff, faculty, graduate, and undergraduate students, and its impact on gender diversity on the government department faculty is still not fully known or understood. We don't know how many women chose alternative career paths, dropped out of the government concentration, master's, and PhD programs, never came up for tenure or were denied tenure. We still don't know the extent of psychological and emotional harm that this has caused for generations of Harvard women. We are here because Harvard's institutional response to our reporting of misconduct was lackluster and anemic at best, and incompetent or complicit at worst. We all reached out to Harvard at various times, starting in 1979, with Charna. More recently, 3 of us, contacted the Title IX office in November 2017 to report our concerns. After months of trying, Harvard staff left us with the impression that it was too busy and too under-resourced to take us seriously. It wasn't until the Chronicle of Higher Education article came out that Harvard genuinely started paying attention to us. Soon after, 15 of us wrote a letter to then Dean Michael Smith explaining how we thought Harvard should respond. We had 2 main demands. First, we wanted a transparent and inclusive Title IX process that resulted in a public report on what violations of Harvard's policies had occurred and what the sanctions would be. We wanted the school to signal that it takes these allegations seriously, something many of us thought was not the case when we first reported or chose not to report at the time misconduct occurred. People did not report historically because they didn't know that this conduct had been going on for decades. So at least in this case, we wanted a record. We wanted the school to make clear that it would no longer sacrifice its female students, staff, and faculty to protect powerful men. Second, we wanted the establishment of an independent commission to investigate what conditions gave rise to 40 years of harassment of women on this campus and what could be done to prevent this from happening in the future. We saw this as an opportunity for Harvard to be proactive, to think about what it could do to ensure women and men have equal opportunities to learn and grow on this campus and beyond. We wanted meaningful introspection and institutional change in response to glaring institutional failures spanning 4 decades. The university did take the important step of banning Jorge Dominguez from campus and revoking his emeritus status. And many of us deeply appreciated Dean Claudine Gay's words in her email announcing this. We appreciated that she shared the findings, albeit at a very high level of abstraction, and sanctions with the community. But many of us chose not to participate, and you might be interested in knowing why. Harvard refused to commit to make public its findings of violations of its policies and sanctions it would impose despite the public attention about this case. And Dean Gay did so only in a very limited way at her discretion after the process was completed. Harvard also refused to guarantee that it would not pursue us under its Title IX process for sharing the results of the investigation or sanctions. To be blunt, many of us were deterred from participating because we felt threatened with retaliation. We still don't know how many people participated in the investigation and what specific violations took place. As for the independent commission, there's a worrisome lack of transparency about its method and goals. Who are they meeting with? Are they considering best practices or research in designing their approach? What form will the findings take? Will they be public? Has Harvard committed to responding to these recommendations? Today we met with the External Review Committee, and they did not answer these questions. Also, President Bakau's email to the government department announcing the creation of the committee explicitly said the committee cannot review the investigation of the Dominguez allegations or review the behavior or decisions of individual members of the Harvard community in the Dominguez matter. How can the committee make recommendations to the community about why misconduct was or wasn't reported, or what keeps people from reporting now without considering the institutional response to these very reports, or why people chose not to participate in the Dominguez Title IX process? So the reason that I picked up the phone to call Harvard in 2017 was because of my then 9-year-old daughter. Wherever she goes to school, I want her to feel safe and empowered and equal. And Harvard's response to a scandal like this has ripple effects far beyond Harvard's gates. But I'm also still here today, and I think I'm saying this for all of us, because I realize I have the privilege and therefore the responsibility to do this. By listening to other women during the last 2 years, I've realized how many women are scared and ashamed and worried about speaking up. They're afraid of consequences to their careers and their families, even decades after misconduct occurred. And their perceptions of these consequences may also depend on what they look like and where they grew up and what opportunities they've had. Also, they've suffered experiences they don't necessarily want to show up in the New York Times or for their kids to be able to Google. Many women simply don't have the psychological and emotional space in their lives to do this. Harvard needs to recognize this. Harvard needs to reach out to these women, and Harvard needs to make institutional change with them in mind. I spent 7 years at Harvard, in college and in law school. And throughout this entire process, I've always thought Harvard can do so much better than this. I hope that our coming forward can help empower others to continue to push for accountability and meaningful change. Thank you again for the opportunity to be here and share with you. Thanks.
Everybody that you have already thanked, and we have very short time, but I mostly want to tell you how this came about. And that is that the Chronicle of Higher Education called me and said, you know, we think you might be the first professor we've ever known who filed a formal complaint and actually kept a career. That was absolutely very shocking to me when they told me that. And they asked me if I would write an article about how to protect yourself and how to keep your career. And I said yes. And then I realized I had no idea how I had kept my career whatsoever, and that I actually couldn't write the article. I was having a lot of trouble writing it. And in the middle of all this, Nienke and Suzanna called me and said, are you the Terry Karl that filed a complaint against Jorge Dominguez in 1983? And I'm holding this, trying to write this article. And I said, yes. And then they proceeded to tell me what had happened to them. And I called the Chronicle of Higher Education and said, I can't write this story. There are more people out there, which I had known, but had no way to do anything about because nobody was willing to file a complaint or go public. And so I said, I think you need to do your own investigation. And as you know, it started with 4 of us, and we now know 18 people formally, and I know more than that in confidence from one serial harasser. So the very first thing I want to say is to you and you and you and you and Debra and all of you who have experienced anything like the trauma of sexual harassment. And I want to quote Maya Angelou to you. And what she said, and this is thanking all of you who've had the courage to organize, to speak out and everything, she said, know that what has happened to you, that you have been changed by what happened, but you have refused to be reduced by it. And that's what I feel about the people on this panel, and I want to thank you so much for being allowed for the first time to actually say at Harvard, and I haven't been here in 3.5 decades, to say at Harvard that I knew he was a serial harasser because I was the only person who filed a formal complaint, but Harvard knew that there were at least 4 other complaints involving undergraduates, graduates, and another faculty member when I filed. So that means that what we're looking at, my report or my complaint, is the tip of the iceberg. And I'm not talking about this case, I'm talking about in general. What we know about universities from a range of studies is that somewhere between 38 and 44% of graduate students report some form of sexual harassment. That's a stunning statistic. That's an AAU study, by the way, that 1 in 5 undergraduates say that they have been sexually assaulted. These are stunning statistics. And the
Both
real...
men and women, or women only?
Both men and women. Both men and women. And I can tell you, by the way, that the male proportion is less, but it is significant. It's about 29% of male undergraduates. Now, that may involve something that we more think of as bullying, but what you find is that bullying and sexual harassment come together. And what I found is that the men who were my students at Harvard and who were graduate students had no way to fight this. I did because of changes in, well, the changes in the law hadn't happened when I fought it, but anyway. What's really important about this is only 3 to 5% of people actually report it, and I think you made it very clear why, Nienke, is it's very, very, very difficult to report these kinds of things. I want to just highlight two things to understand about harassment, is that harassment happens most in those fields that are least diverse. So, and by diversity, I mean by race, by gender, et cetera. And in those fields that are least diverse in the social sciences, there are only 2 that are women are completely underrepresented across the United States, and that is political science / government, and the other one is economics. So those are the fields that you're likely to see more, this is harassment because by field and underrepresentation of women. But the other way you know is by the prestige of the school. The higher the school's prestige, the more likely you see harassment and the less likely you see reporting. And these are everything I'm giving you, I can give you the studies later if you want. So this means that Harvard, for example, has a problem because it's both prestigious and it has underrepresentation of diversity in the departments where you find some of the worst problems. Now, the diversity issue is absolutely linked to sexual harassment and sex discrimination. And the reason it's linked, let me give you an example. Cynthia Verb is here, and her husband Sid was one of the first people to ever really bring young, untenured women to the government department. I was one of them. All 3 of us left. 2 of us were harassed, one by 2 professors. My story, most of you know. And all of us left. But when I look at the faculty in the government department today, I see my colleagues who were male colleagues, 4 of them, who got tenure. So what is the story there when all the women leave and the men get tenure? And what it shows us, and this is not my statistics, but in underrepresented and highly prestigious fields, men have more than 50% advantage in getting a permanent position. So that keeps what I would call a vicious cycle. You have a vicious cycle between harassment, gender discrimination, and the inability to report, the whisper network that graduate students use, et cetera. And the other thing I want to say is that, first of all, sexual harassment is traumatic. And unless there are policies and procedures that deal with trauma, it's a shock to your system when you walk in the door and your professor kisses you on the lips. It's a shock to your system. It's a shock to your system when your boss tells you that if you don't sleep with him, he's going to ruin your career. These are shocks to your system, and they're very, very traumatic, even if they don't result in real, what some people used to tell me was real physical violence. And I would go, well, I'm sorry, it's a shock to your system. It's a shock to your system when somebody is using his power, and this is about power, it is not about sex. It is about power to ruin your career, to humiliate you, to bully you, to treat you with complete and total scorn or degradation, to introduce you in your professional field as a slave. You know, these things are very, very damaging. And it's worse when the remedy is re-traumatizing. And in my case, and this is very important because this means that the procedures that other people are going to talk about, please keep this in mind. Victims are traumatized, and you can re-traumatize them by the very procedures that were set up to make them okay in the first place. In my case, I can tell you that I was offered bodyguards to go to faculty meetings. That's a stunning statement.
Tell them why.
Why?
What did you complain about? Why'd they offer you
Well,
money?
because I had filed this complaint, the person I'd filed against, who all of you know, was everywhere on campus, everywhere. And I was supposed to sit across the table from him and work with him.
What did he say about rape?
Oh, well, I mean, I think most of you have read or may know, but he, and it's not just what he said about rape, it's when he said it. We were having a fight over a graduate student. We were standing outside this building, actually. We were standing outside this building, and I thought a particular female graduate student was terrific. And he said, "You're putting too much energy into her, leave her to me, and she's not as good as you think." That's what he said. And when I started to argue with him and say, "She's really smart, she's really good," and he said, "This would be a very nice place for a rape." So it's about your judgment, it's about your profession. These things, as I said, are traumatizing, and because they're traumatizing, the procedures and policies that need to be put in place have to recognize that. The language people are using now in some of the best practices is trauma-based policies and procedures. If you go to Title IX, and Nienke, you didn't say what Title IX said to you, but what they said was, to her, is you tell us the department and we'll tell you who the harasser is. That's a terrifying statement to me, because that means they know, and they're not doing something. So who's responsible for this? Who's responsible for this kind of a situation that affects so many of us? First of all, I believe that I did everything I could to protect the students who had come to me crying because they were being harassed by Dominguez. And so I believe that the responsibility lies first and foremost with the leadership of Harvard, and the leadership of Harvard all the way through from my case on. This was in the New York Times, it was in the not the Washington Post, it was in the New York Times, it was in Time Magazine, it was in the Boston Globe, everybody knew about this. I also think that responsibility lies with bystanders and enablers. And this is very, very important because, Elie Wiesel said at one point, what hurts the victim the most is not the cruelty of the powerful person that's hurting them, but it is the silence of a bystander. So bystanders have to say what they see and have to support each other, otherwise this won't change. So finally, let me just end up with a couple of really quick remarks. One is, you cannot break the vicious cycle of silence without sanctions. And you cannot have sanctions unless you tell us what they are. So none of us know what happened to the professor who harassed us. None of us. We don't know. Nobody's told us. None of us know whether, and we did find that he's still listed on administrative leave at Harvard. He is still, there's still a prize in his honor and name. Now, never mind. What's that about? But what I want to say is, what has to change? What's the most important thing to change? Well, frankly, I have a feeling I'm speaking for all of us, we would like an apology. We would like an apology. And when I say we would like an apology, I don't mean a non-apology apology, I mean a real apology. And here's what Moses Maimonides, who was a very famous rabbi in the Middle Ages, said. He said apologies, real ones, depend first and foremost on confession. And then a rabbi here in Massachusetts picked up that idea, so I'm borrowing from him, but these are my words. This is what I would like to hear. This is my imagine. If I were singing the song Imagine, this is what I would like to hear. I would like to hear from Harvard, we confess that we have not fully recognized that we receive the benefits from a societal structure that affords us every privilege and opportunity as a white male. I would like to hear that. I would like to hear this. We confess that our eyes have been too closed to the frequent suffering that women endure and blind to what was happening right in front of us. I would like to hear this. We confess that we have not done enough to address the inequalities that challenge women, and especially women of color, in universities, and particularly this university. And if we hear that, I think we would then begin to see that something is different here. And it's not just Harvard, by the way, it's all of the elite universities. And so I want to just close by saying that I would really like to hear this. To all of you who've been hurt by Harvard, I would like to hear Harvard commit to make amends in some way. To those people who really changed their careers, left school, I can tell you how many of my graduate students left, you know. I would like them to hear this from Harvard. They're sorry. And I would also say that showing the courage to do this at the top of Harvard, at the very top, would mean that they would match the courage of the women at this table. And in my view, and I want to say this to anybody who is hurt here, courage and community courage is the best protection that a woman could ever have. Thank you.
It is really hard to speak after Terry Karl in this moment, but I'm going to do it. I'm up here with her. When I came to graduate school in the Gov department, I was a little lost, especially in my early years as a graduate student. I came here thinking I was going to be a formal modeler, and I found out that I really was not well suited to that. So I was a little adrift, and I was also an outsider. No one in my family is in academia or anywhere near academia, and I thought if I was admitted to be a formal modeler, and it turns out that I'm not, then maybe my admission was a mistake and I shouldn't be here. You know, this is a textbook case of imposter syndrome. And in my vulnerability, Jorge Dominguez saw opportunity. So when he expressed interest in my work and he expressed interest in my potential as a scholar, I made him the chair of my general exam committee. I'm sure second-year PhD students in the room understand I was a little stressed out at that time anyway for general exams. I had a meeting in his office to talk about it a few weeks before, late in the day. At the end of the meeting, he asked for a hug goodbye. I gave him one and he slid his hand onto my butt. I did not know what to do. I told a few of my classmates. He was the director of the Weatherhead Center. He had recently been promoted to vice provost. So basically, he was in charge of funding for IR and comparative students, and he was also in charge of my general exam that was coming up in a few weeks. So I felt trapped. This is how predators work. Okay, so one of my friends in my cohort had heard a rumor that there was some woman in the 1980s who had, and this was the rumor, hidden a video camera and gotten video evidence, and that Harvard had still sided with him. And I thought to myself, okay, she had video evidence, Harvard sided with him. I have no evidence. Second-year grad student, vice provost. My word against his. I did not report. I got through my general exam, I went home for the summer, and this is when I made a really good decision for myself. I decided I am not going to work with Jorge Dominguez. And I decided I would never go in his office again. And I want to give this some context. I had no idea what my prospectus was going to be at this point. I did not know how I was going to get a prospectus committee together, how I was going to defend it, how I was going to write a dissertation, and how I was going to graduate. Okay? I did not know at the time. But I decided I was not going to work with Jorge Dominguez. And so what I want to say is to graduate students in the room or who watch this, make good decisions for yourself. I want to say that you can make decisions to nurture your own strength, even when you don't know where those decisions are going to lead. If you're being harassed, get out of that situation. Do not let this place convince you that any faculty member is so powerful or so important that their letter of recommendation is necessary for you to have a good career, they are not worth it. You are going to live with yourself for the rest of your life, and if you're experiencing harassment, I want to support you and encourage you in saying that you can find another way. Even if you don't know what that way is, find it. And then the second thing I want to say is that women should not have to find another way. So when I walked into Jorge Dominguez's office looking for a mentor because I figured out I wasn't going to be a formal modeler, I should have walked into Terry Karl's office. That would have been a mentor, okay? And the thing is that I am not angry because Jorge Dominguez let me down. I am angry because Harvard University knowingly employed Jorge Dominguez after what he did to Terry Karl. After Terry Karl's students wrote an About Dominguez letter to the editor in the Crimson demanding that he be fired in the 1980s. Okay? If they had listened, if they had done that, it would not have happened to me. So I am angry because Harvard University has absolutely failed in upholding its obligation under Title IX, and they're continuing to fail in upholding that obligation. So I just want to close by saying, when I was a graduate student, I was not brave enough to speak up. And so I want to applaud all the graduate students in this room that have been striking, that have made this a platform, that have been speaking out, because I was not that brave. But I am now, and I'm here lending my voice along with these women across generations, because it's time for us to tell Harvard, time's up. I'm with you.
Hello, everyone. I'm Charna Sherman. I was a major in government, actually a double major in government and history. And to give you a sense how long ago that was, I'm going to be coming back in May and for my 40th reunion. And just to give you an idea how long ago that was, I was the first class of merged admissions. I was a girl who competed against boys to get my place at Harvard College. And my female classmates were the first women to ever get Harvard diplomas, along with an extra signature from Radcliffe. And so that matters in this case, because in 1979, I was, 20, 21. I came from a very conservative, all-girl, do-good prep school. And being the overachiever that I was, I went to office hours of a professor I understood I was supposed to hold in high regard and admire. And he got up from his chair and he kissed me on the lips. I was stunned. Shock is actually the right word. But I want to leave the shock aside, because what really matters is the following. And I don't know where it came from. I reported him in 1979. I used the procedures to the extent they existed. I went to my government tutor. I don't even know if you have those anymore. And I made an ask. I said, I don't want this man to be a reader on my honors thesis. And he said to me, okay, I'll go get that done. And he came back and gave me the assurance that the department had agreed that Professor Dominguez wouldn't be one of my readers, and he wasn't. So I have every reason to believe, as I sit here now, to believe that the higher-ups in the department knew about my complaint. And what's even more significant about it is that when Terry Karl, several years later, brought to bear even worse allegations, she was never told that I ever existed. And again, for all of you who are so much younger than me, the internet did not exist then, okay? So it was not as if I could have known what was going on with Terry, or that she could have somehow figured out who I was years later. I have devoted most of my legal career to battling systemic gender discrimination. And I have some insights to share, even though it was a different field. And so you all understand the law, okay? This is a profession where equality and justice are supposed to be principles to which we're ethically bound. And yet, what I have found is that institutions, when confronted with issues of gender harassment or gender discrimination, respond with reactions that favor the institution and those in power. And so I'm here to tell you that from my perspective, and granted, it's a battle-tested, somewhat jaded, and long-view perspective, but I will tell you my belief that Harvard has not, to date, adequately addressed what is before you. I have 6 observations to share with you, which as a lawyer I submit actually support my view. Okay. So number 1, and I mentioned this earlier when we met with the external committee, it bears a little resemblance to last week's events, which I trust the government department will be addressing with vigor. And that is, as we sit here today, we know that no one, not Title IX, not anyone else on this campus, has ever considered all of the evidence. We did not, most of us did not participate as complainants in the Title IX process, so we know our stories weren't in there, and we know of others who did not participate. So Title IX did not cover all of this. And I'm a government alum, okay? I did not receive any communication about what was going on in this department in my capacity as an alum. So there are 4 decades of your own alumni from whom you might find significant and important information about what they confronted and who knew what at the time and who did or didn't do what at the time. Second observation, it is critical that we do not know his punishment. I just Googled before I came here today just to see what's on the web, okay? He looks like any other professor. There's a web page. It says he's on administrative leave, but he's got Harvard contact information. That's a problem, okay? That is a problem, because he's not just anyone. And as Terry mentioned, there's a prize, an actual prize that still exists in his honor. But I will tell you, and I said this straightforwardly to the external committee today, I said to them that I found it untenable that they were charged with putting off limits. That was the president's message, off limits what occurred for the last 4 decades. In my view, that is a signature tactic of an institution trying to protect itself. We don't want to know the facts. We want to move forward. And another signature tactic, and this is observation number 4. Another signature tactic is to divide and conquer. You separate those with complaints. You don't let them combine to their evidence or their voice. You actually not just separate them, you make them think they're the crazy ones. Here, we begged, we said, we want to be one voice in front of Title IX. And we actually want you, under these circumstances, to use different measures which were allowed under Title IX, and there's even a procedure that would have allowed the Board of Overseers to use. And the answer to us was no. So we didn't actually participate. Number 5, there's telling evidence that your culture Your culture is still, again, what you find in institutions that don't want to change. And that's a culture of, let's keep our heads down. I'm not going to get involved. It's not really directly about me. I'm going to let it pass. And how do I know that that is still your culture? I want to be clear. I obviously don't have a problem saying my mind. I wrote the head of the government department at the time, and I said to her with very impassioned language, that you are one of only 2 women who have ever had the privilege and been in a position of power in this department, and that it is a special duty, a special obligation on you to exercise your voice and exercise your privilege and be a leader on this issue. She took a long time to respond. Okay. But then she did. And she put the following actually in writing to me. She informed me that she was not ready to accept, and then she said what she termed my exhortation. Rather, she, quote, planned to wait and see what the university does. I'm here to tell you, it doesn't make sense to promote women if when they get the chance to use their voice, they're too afraid to do so. And so it's important that we get at that. And in addition to that, I mean, I don't know Steve Levinsky. I don't even know if I'm pronouncing his name right. But I will tell you, from an outsider's point of view, I understand that he was a protege of Professor Dominguez's. So how on earth does he get appointed as the head of the culture committee that's going to address these issues? And understand, he may be a great guy. He may be a great leader. He may, in fact, be a great scholar. But what does that say? That you have chosen someone who ascended to that position at the expense of those that Dominguez harassed. And finally, Terry touched on this, but I'm going to go further. Nothing has been done for the direct victims. In fact, we haven't even figured out who they all are. There hasn't been an apology, and even the external committee didn't ask to speak with us. We demanded a hearing with them because our position was that they couldn't possibly have a report that had any validity if, in fact, they had not at least spoken to us. And I want to say further that nothing has been done to apologize to the indirect victims. These women have heard me say, and the higher-ups at Harvard have heard me say, there is a road of carnage that has occurred here. Women whose lives have been changed and were deprived an equal education and an equal opportunity from this institution. And all you do actually, look at today's front page of the Harvard Crimson and the blasphemy that I consider, the tragedy that I consider to be that a woman was denied tenure and the First Circuit took the position that there wasn't any evidence that her dealings with Professor Dominguez had anything to do with it. Seriously, can that really be the case? Debra is the expert on how to address these issues, but I have a few suggestions. Here's my first one. Here's my first one. The strongest tactic against the divide and separate strategy is to stay together. The fact that you have made efforts as a union, that you have come together today, strengthens all of you. It's critical. Number 2, stay vigilant. 40 years, we're still here. We made some progress, there's more to make. Martin Luther King, The arc of history tends towards justice. We wouldn't be here if we didn't believe that there is more change that can occur. And here's my last. Terry doesn't know that I've been actually arguing for this. Symbols matter. Lily Ledbetter led an incredibly lone effort to bring justice on equal pay. She did it for decades. When I had an opportunity to meet her and I asked her what was the worst, and she said it was about being so alone when she went through it. But at the end of the day, the Congress of the United States named the legislation to correct what was wrong, what they knew was the right answer after her. I'm here to tell you that Terry Karl literally threw her career across the train tracks in order to stop an oncoming predator, and frankly, for all of you. And you know what? She's never been told that she was right. And my belief is, this institution really wants to send the message of, what is the right thing to do? Is it to speak up? Is it to stop predators? I don't know. Make it the Terry Karl Prize, or even better, give her the honorary degree that she should have actually earned here. And then 10,000 men of Harvard and the next 10,000 women of Harvard will have an idea of what it means to have an equal education and equal opportunity at this august university.
Well, I don't know how to follow any of that, but I do want to start with some thanks to the four of you. Your tenacity and commitment to making sure that nobody at this institution in the future is treated the way that you were treated and failed the way that you were failed is really incredible, and as a student here, I am incredibly grateful for it, so thank you. I think it goes without saying that this institution would be a better place if you hadn't been pushed out and if you taught here today and we had you as a resource. My name is Sejal Singh and I'm a 3L at the law school. I've spent years organizing students who are building power on their campuses and trying to make sure that these institutions live up to their legal and moral obligations to end sexual harassment on campus and guarantee the equal opportunity to learn. I started organizing around sexual harassment and violence in schools as a college student and a survivor myself. I saw firsthand as a college student how the students that I knew were being systemically pushed out of their education by these forms of violence and discrimination. I'm really struck hearing from you how similar the reality is today. I saw student after student pushed out of their major because they couldn't sit in a class when someone who'd assaulted them sat right behind them. I saw students who simply left the school for a year because they would just wait for someone who'd harmed them to graduate. I saw students who left our institution entirely. And when 1 in 5 women at the time, according to the best data that we had, was experiencing sexual harassment and violence, and the best data that we had showed that trans and gender nonconforming students were experiencing even more sexual harassment and violence. And on top of that, there was so little attention to the needs of this particular population that there was almost no data available in the first place. You know, we could not help but understand this as a civil rights issue, right? So we have a civil rights statute, Title IX, that says that everyone, regardless of their gender, has an equal opportunity to learn on their campus. And when sexual harassment and violence is systemically pushing people out of school, denying them the equal opportunity to learn, that is a civil rights issue. So after graduating, I joined a group called Know Your 9 that was helping to build resources for youth organizers, specifically around understanding and fighting these issues as a civil rights issue, right? We can't learn equally, we can't research and teach equally when somebody who's harmed us works behind us, or sits behind us in class or works with us in a lab. And we knew that, schools have long had, for decades, courts have understood that schools have a legal obligation to address sexual harassment because they are required to make sure that when someone experiences this harm, they're not denied the chance to learn as a result. And yet, at the time, I started organizing around this issue in 2013. Hundreds of schools across the country were failing to do that. I worked with students who reported sexual harassment to their schools and were told, well, you don't really want to go through this process because it's going to be really hard, and do you really want to do it to that guy? I worked with students who tried to figure out what the process was and couldn't figure it out at all. I worked with students who would report and the school would deny them critical accommodations. I think the thing that what students wanted most often was just like really simple stuff, like being moved out of a class with someone who'd harmed them, or an extension on a paper, or mental health resources, and they were systemically denied them, right? And those are the things that schools are sort of in a unique position to provide. So at Know Your 9, we began running Know Your Rights trainings around the country, trying to democratize information about people's rights, how to file complaints with the education department, and pressure schools to follow the law. In 2014, Know Your 9 successfully pressured the education department to release a list of schools facing civil rights investigations relating to their failure to address sexual harassment. At the time, there were 55 schools on the list, and by January 2017, because students were organized around this issue and understood their rights, that number had ballooned to over 300 schools. And at the time, there were several open complaints against Harvard for failing both undergrads and graduate students. But the new administration, unsurprisingly, because it's led by a rapist, immediately began rolling back students' civil rights and sending schools a message that they could ignore student civil rights across a number of fronts, basically with impunity. Secretary DeVos's first action was to revoke a document that about trans students' rights in schools, and effectively telling schools that if they were going to discriminate against trans young people, the Department of Education was going to turn a blind eye. The administration revoked critical guidance about sexual harassment and violence in schools. Then they released proposed regulations that have the primary effect of limiting schools' liability when they sweep sexual harassment under the rug. For example, the proposed rule would allow schools to ignore sexual harassment and assault that occurs off campus and outside educational programs, as though students don't continue to be students outside campus, and as though sexual harassment that you happen to experience outside the gates of Harvard doesn't affect your life here.
Fraternity sports events.
Right, precisely. The new rule would also define sexual harassment that schools have to respond to very narrowly to be unwelcome conduct on the basis of sex that is so severe and pervasive and objectively offensive that it, quote, effectively denies a person equal access to education programs. And the key part of this is that the Trump Education Department, their view is that schools should have to respond to discrimination or harassment that does not rise to this level. And the takeaway from that for schools and for the education department appears to be that if you experience sexual harassment and violence and you think it's probably going to affect your education or your career, if there's no intervention, you're going to have to wait until it affects your education and career before the school has to do something about it, which seems pretty fucked up to me, if you'll excuse my language. So if you want the school to respond proactively, you might be out of luck under these proposed regulations. If you experience harassment, but for whatever reason you're not affected in sort of the specific ways that your school understands, you probably are out of luck. I want to be clear that these rules have not gone into effect yet, but the final rule is probably coming out very soon, and there will be work by students and lawyers to stop it, but that is this is the administration that we might otherwise turn to enforce our rights, and that students might otherwise have turned to hold schools accountable when they fail to live up to their legal obligations to protect students. So I think it's pretty clear that they are no longer a real avenue to whom we can turn. And I want to add that the education department says that they're doing this because they care about fair process and school discipline. Fair process and school discipline is incredibly important and something that many of the advocates in this space advocate for ourselves. But we know it's not a real priority to the Trump administration because as part of their rollback of civil rights laws, they've also revoked critical Obama-era rules that are designed to take on the racial disparities in school discipline at the K through 12 level. They've revoked guidance that requires process for schools before suspending Black, Latinx, and Native kids. So it's pretty clear, to us that this is pretextual and that the real goal here is to give schools a free pass for ignoring these particular rights. So what does that mean for us here on this campus? It means that the Trump administration cares even less about our right to be free from sexual harassment and to learn equally than Harvard's does. And that's a pretty low bar, which means that we need power and leverage to make this school respect our rights. That's one of the main reasons that I organize with HGSU-UAW, our grad workers union. I'm a proud member of HGSU. Like many law students, I've moved in and out of research and teaching positions in the bargaining unit throughout my time here. And I joined HGSU as a 1L almost immediately because I've seen firsthand how a union can ensure that we're all paid fairly, treated equally, and how unions in particular can help women, people of color, trans and gender nonconforming students, and students with disabilities. In my pre-law school job, I worked at a prominent think tank where our staff unionized, and it was only through the union that I realized that I was being paid significantly less than all the white men who did equivalent work to me, and it was only through the union that this was remedied. So not only did I get a significant raise, which is great, I saw that I was able to see gender and racial discrimination in my workplace and address it. And it wasn't just me. We also didn't have a disability accommodations policy. That was fixed by our union, and we improved our sexual harassment response. What I took away from that experience is by building real power in our institutions, we can force change, because appealing to their sort of like moral principle just doesn't seem to be working very well. So Harvard graduate workers voted to form a union my first year here, just weeks after we learned, because of you, that Jorge Dominguez had been harassing students and colleagues and undergraduates, and that Harvard knew about it for literally longer than I have been alive. Pretty messed up. And fighting sexual harassment and racial discrimination have been and are core issues from the campaign from day one, but the Dominguez cover-up really drove that home. And it was it continues to be a central issue for us. But because of the administration's union busting tactics, we are still fighting for a fair contract that with protections against sexual harassment and racial discrimination. So specifically, here's what we're fighting for. We are fighting for a contract that prohibits sexual harassment, racial discrimination, disability discrimination, and all other forms of discriminatory treatment. And we're asking for an avenue to enforce those protections. We're looking for an independent, third-party grievance procedure where a neutral, trained party is responsible for hearing and resolving cases. The grievance procedure would be an additional option for students reporting gender, racial, or disability discrimination where the school had failed them. And the decision of whether to pursue it would be entirely up to the individual survivor. You would have the right to decide what avenue would be right for you. But here's why we need it. The grievance procedure removes potential conflicts of interest. Right now, the people who are responsible for addressing sexual harassment on campus are all Harvard employees, right? Here we would have a neutral party whose fee would be split 50-50 between the university and our union. That's what our dues would go towards. We wouldn't have to rely on the federal government to make Harvard follow civil rights law. We would have some alternatives. We know that this has worked for other students and at other universities. For example, an international student worker at the University of Connecticut used this grievance procedure in her union contract to seek recourse for sexual harassment after the Title IX office just failed to process her case. And as a result of the independent arbitration, she was able to stay in the country, finish her graduate studies, and get the accommodations that she needed to continue her work. It is true that the grievance procedure would have limited ability to impose sort of punitive sanctions, but it would be an option, again, for people who choose to decide who choose it because they think it's the right option for them, and because they think it's the best way to get the accommodations that we desperately need to stay in school when we experience this. And you would have union representation in this process. You would not have to go through it alone. So this seems like a pretty reasonable request to me. And, of course, we are also fighting for other things that deeply implicate gender and racial justice, including protections for international students, decent health care, which obviously is relevant, and fair pay. And Harvard has opposed all of those, but in particular, they have responded by specifically and exclusively seeking to carve out protections from discrimination and harassment out of the contract. They want a specific exclusion that says that the contract does not cover or protect us from these particular very serious forms of exploitation and mistreatment. That's pretty much unheard of. I mean, I'm not a labor lawyer yet, but I do know enough to know that's pretty much unheard of in contract negotiations. So we responded by organizing a no carve-out campaign, telling the university, we had hundreds of students rallying to tell the university that we were not going to accept a contract that does not protect us against racial and gender-based discrimination. We have continued to demand that in our bargaining sessions, and I'm not on the bargaining committee, but we have a pretty open process, and I've seen some of the proposals that we've put forward on non-discrimination, and they are comprehensive, and they are detailed, and they include robust protections on the basis of disability and gender identity and criminal records history. And the university's response is their proposal was a paragraph long. It is insulting how little they seem to care about this. And there's no way to interpret that other than the university knows what they are doing badly, how they would be held accountable in a neutral process, and they don't want to do anything about it. And it is especially horrific to us to know this because we know that the university knew about Jorge Dominguez, and if I ran an institution and I found out that for over 30 years, people had filed complaints, and the university found this man responsible in the 80s, I would want to at least figure out what went wrong and try to figure out if there are other people who are putting our students' education at risk. I didn't even know that. I would at least look on the Crimson for if there had been letters to the Crimson about other professors, and it seems like none of that has happened. And I think the only way that's just not going to change, right? You can't believe that this institution is going to do the right thing when you see their total failure to make any kind of systemic changes in response to what you have all exposed. And so the only way that we make this university take sexual harassment seriously is if we build power on this campus. And I think the way that we do that is with the union. We just know there's power in a union, and if we don't stick together, like you said, we're never going to see justice.
Wow. I just keep moving about what I want to say, and I'm just going to keep my remarks really short because I want an opportunity for all of you to talk about the things that are most meaningful. I want to talk about something that you said with Betsy DeVos, because this was a theme that came up in the Kavanaugh hearings, and it's how these fuckers hijack our hurts and our pain and distort. So in the Kavanaugh hearing, Christine Ford was obviously telling the truth. Any rational person who watched that testimony knew exactly what this was about. We've experienced it. We've had friends experience it. It was raw. She was not a rehearsed witness. She told the truth, and we all recognize that truth. So what did they do? They then talked about two backlash themes. Now, this is not the backlash of the 80s. This is a more sophisticated backlash. This is the backlash of, she's telling the truth, she just didn't know who assaulted her. Remember that? Mm-hmm. She was right. She was assaulted. Clearly, something terrible happened to Dr. Ford. She just didn't know who it was. Even though her testimony was emblazoned in her hippocampus, and we know the biopsychology of trauma, and she educated the nation about what that was about. She knew exactly who assaulted her. So when that didn't work, we then had to move to this vague notion of due process. How can men have to deal with allegations that are 25, 30 years old when the victims do not know the details with that level of specificity, right? She didn't know what block it was on. Well, she certainly knew who assaulted her, and she knew all the details of that. But let's discredit her because she doesn't know what block it took place on, or what the month was, or what the date of the week was, or what she had for breakfast. Well, that's not how trauma works. So when that backlash narrative started of he deserves process and how long can men have to answer to things that happen in high school, there was this theme of, as mothers of sons, we should all be very scared about what could happen to our sons. Now, I'm the mother of a son, and I am not scared about my son being falsely accused. My son is a staunch feminist, and I think this is a theme of whipping people up about we have to protect our men because they're so vulnerable to women who are always making these things up. That is a backlash narrative that we have to be very worried about. And the other is, as we organized, as we took to the streets at the Kavanaugh hearing, as survivors got up, as unions got together, as nonprofits, and as people who were so offended by what they heard just organically took to the streets in Washington, D.C., we had to listen to McConnell talk about the danger of an angry mob. The danger of an angry mob flashed every night on Fox News. Due process for men, people can be falsely accused at any time, and then what happened with that? That was their theme. And McConnell to this day, and it was a focus group theme, by the way, because it taps on the worst fears and stereotypes about women. It was a focus-tested theme that worked. And that was what gave them the out, is to talk about there was no due process. Now, who is due process for? That is not a notion that comes into context. It is not an appropriate notion for an advise and consent of the Senate's responsibility to look at Supreme Court nominees. This is basically a job interview, people. We didn't have to prove the man was a rapist. But we did see, on plain view, him taking to his testimony. It was globally televised. He was misogynist. He was belligerent. He was entitled, if I heard one more time sitting in this room, that he went to Yale, so he should have a lifetime appointment on the U.S. Supreme Court. And everybody was like, yeah, he went to Yale. He worked really hard. A lot of people work really hard. So then we have Betsy DeVos, and it's the same thing. Instead of taking the Title IX protections that are protecting students from discrimination, which includes harassment and sexual violence, it's we need to invert this and put this on its head, and protect those who are falsely accused. Now, first of all, everyone deserves appropriate protection. You know, there's nobody in the survivor community, in the feminist legal community, or anywhere else who doesn't believe that fairness is very important. It is. But to suggest that we throw away rights of students who need protection from discrimination and from sexual violence because a very small percentage of people find themselves in that position, it's just wrong. And we have to be advocates for everybody, but let's look at what really are the problems. And the rights of falsely accused is a really small problem. It's important, but it's a really, really small problem. So, I don't know where I'm getting with this. I've been sitting at the Weinstein trial for the last 2 weeks, which is pretty devastating. It's pretty devastating to see people who are such studied predators, as Dominguez was, as Harvey Weinstein was, being able to figure out who they can violate with impunity because people don't have the power to stand up to it, because they feel alone, because they need the assistance to go forward in their designated or their hoped careers. And then at the end of that, to sit through a trial where these women are being savaged because they stayed in touch with the person who did this to them. And we know the statistics that 80 to 85% of women, and the statistics I'm speaking to are about women. I know there are other statistics in other impacted communities, that when they are sexually assaulted or abused by people who they know, 85% are likely to stay in touch in some way. And to be victimized and re-victimized, and to have your motives impugned, and to suggest you're lying or you consented to rape because you then tried to stay in touch as you were trying to make sense of it, as you were trying to regroup, as you were trying to not be just smushed and eradicated. And that's what we're listening to day by day in the Weinstein trial. So, on a very hopeful note, and this is a hopeful note, I mean, the beauty and the power of the Me Too movement is these women found each other. They did.
That's true.
They did. After the Me Too movement, they went on Facebook, like many people do, and they connected. And when people connect, and they find community, and they tell their truth, there is an undeniable courage that can come from them. And by creating forums like this, where people come together, and they talk about what's happened, and they make a commitment to support one another, and to not be quiet in the face of this, I genuinely believe the world changes. And people ask me all the time, is Christine, is she okay? Does she feel good about the decision? And I think the reality is, the jury is still out. The jury was out with Anita Hill for a very long time. But I think it is undeniable that when people speak their truth, the world changes and it shifts and you can't go back. And I think we are in a moment, a very strange moment, of having a rapist at the White House. I mean, we do. Having rollbacks on our most fundamental rights. Roe v. Wade is under attack like never before. I mean, all of our rights that are most fundamental are under attack like never before. And yet, we are coming together in ways that I think are really, really powerful. And we just have to do it. And we just have to do it, and we've got to retake our democracy, and we've got to get rid of these war criminals. We were talking about having a Truth and Reconciliation Commission today, and maybe we need it. So I'm going to open this up to all of you, but just thank you. And, it's mostly going to be your generation that brings us home. Frankly, I'm really tired. I really am tired. But you're smarter than we are, and you're more organized. And, do it. Just don't back up. You just don't let up. So thank you for your work. What you're talking about, what needs to be done, I wholly support. I think collective action is the only way. And thank you for the four of you for your bravery and for knowing that this was much bigger than the four of you and that this made a difference to this community today. So thank you.
To open it up to Q&A. We have limited time, so please do your best to keep your questions brief. And I might try and repeat the question just to get it on the mic, because I'm told that we do have viewers on our live stream from, I think, as far afield as Peru and Chile, at least. So I will try and repeat the questions just to make sure they're heard. So please, we'll open it up now.
Before we start, I think we should also thank Sophie, who put on this
and
event.
And many other
Right,
graduates who
and
are
although
around here.
many of you are, you in particular are too humble to say so, have led a lot of this collective action, and we wouldn't be having this conversation still if it weren't for you.
I have about 1,000 questions, but I'm going to just try with the last one that came to mind, which is you're talking about the importance of coming together and finding other people who are similarly victimized. I'll just say I just went through the Title IX process at the HLS. The independent investigation found that my story was absolutely credible, and that the professor there was lying and self-contradicting, and the final report went to the panel, and it disappeared from view. Like, everything's very, very, very transparent, and then all of a sudden, you don't know what's going on, and then two days before Christmas, I got a letter saying that they didn't find enough evidence, which I thought that they were just supposed to take, the final report and then find appropriate sanctions. So, okay. So it's the pattern at Harvard is established. One of the problems that I have for the next step is the danger of speaking out, and especially speaking out about names. But I feel like it's really important to say the name so that you can find other people who were similarly victimized. And I guess in most cases, there isn't just one. Is that correct? So
Can I
what
say
are the
something about
dangers? What do people find? How do perpetrators retaliate when their names are in the papers or when their names are come out? And what's the best process?
I want to just say, the first thing that I learned is that you almost always can find other victims. The great majority of predators are serial predators. I didn't know that a long time ago, but we can see that now. We just don't have, the latest statistics are 51%. Debra told me she thinks that's under, or Charna, one of you said that it was underreported, which I'm sure. So my guess is there are other people out there. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not going to talk about the legal dangers of that. But I can tell you that when the Chronicle of Higher Education story came out, I got somewhere between 8,000 and 10,000 emails because my name was there and people saw that story. And in that process, I have learned, a lot of them were from Harvard, by the way, and in that process, I learned that there's a sexual harasser, according to several emails, in the English department. There's one in the anthropology department. There's one in this Kennedy School of Government. There's one in, I can't even remember the other department, but you get the point. These people wrote, they called, they cried, they did, I mean, it was devastating. It was devastating, and I had to hire somebody to help me get through this and to triage them. But what I want to say about that is these folks found each other through Facebook, I believe. I'm not on Facebook. But there are all kinds of records because there is, and this is the failure of the procedures, by the way. The failure of the procedures means that the whisper network starts. That's what happens. It's a failure of procedures. It's not something I'm in favor of in the long run because it's a due process issue, I think, among many other things. But it is the only way that people can find out who else had this experience. And I guarantee you that that somebody in Title IX knows the answer to that. I mean, I would be really surprised if they don't. And so all I can say as the non-lawyer in the group is that you have to use the whisper network. That's what you did, that's what they did. And
You put his name in your Facebook report?
I Googled.
I did the Me Too post.
She did a Me Too post, and I Googled Jorge Dominguez sexual harassment. And I found...
And up I came.
Well, I actually found a few things. I found a website put up by graduate students talking about him, and I found Suzanna's Me Too post. And then I found more information about Terry and other people and the Crimson thing and from many years ago. And I mean, I think what was very important for me was seeing Suzanna's post, because then it was like, well, what the hell? I mean, this is clearly not a one-shot or two-shot deal. And so that was very important and empowering. And then I Googled Suzanna and I found out where she was and called her up, and we had a conversation, and I posted on the Harvard Class of '99 Facebook page, and I wrote, has anyone had a bad experience with a professor while in college? And I got one response within 24 hours from someone about this same professor, and one response about an English professor. So, and then that person, the Gov professor was Dominguez, and she, and the two of us then contacted Title IX at the same time. So we really sort of did it together, which I think was important because we didn't feel like as alone in the process. When you know that there are other people, you also feel more of a responsibility in some ways, because you say, well, you know, he was teaching a freshman seminar at the time that I found that out. And then I thought, well, you know, so I think those kinds of things are important for your own sort of like psychological handling of things.
I'm sorry to be the conservative voice here, but part of what's happening with backlash right now is that students on campuses who are filing Title IX charges against rapists are being sued. People who are posting things online to try to find other people who've had shared experiences are being sued for defamation. And this is now this is backlash tactics. So I think it's not a one-size-fits-all. Certainly, there was a moment after the Me Too movement hit and Alyssa Milano's tweet where everybody was writing everything. But there is definitely an effort, and it's an organized effort for men's rights groups and FIRE and other groups to go after people who are coming forward. So that's scary.
We
I think
were
that's
afraid, we
absolutely-
were worried about that. We were worried, and the Chronicle of Higher Ed was worried about it. I mean, they ran all their articles by attorneys, they showed us, you know, they asked us all kinds, they interviewed my
witnesses.
college roommate who's right there, who I'm super grateful is here. And so they were worried about it. And the other thing I would say, and I'm not providing legal advice at all in this exchange, is see if there's someone on the faculty that you trust, that you can talk to, that could, you know, provide advice or support, you know? I don't know.
Yeah, I think there are also sort of, this is a systemic issue, right? The data suggests that something like 80% of people who complain about sexual harassment in the workplace experience retaliation. And Debbie's absolutely right that today, cross complaints, right? Complaints, when you file a complaint, your perpetrator files a complaint against you, that has become very common. Libel complaints have become very common. And I think that underscores sort of two interventions that we need. First, I think that shows that fair process in these investigations is in fact incredibly important. I think it's sort of a false choice to suggest that these things are at odds. I don't think that anybody at this table thinks the process isn't important. And I think that it actually is so important for survivors too, because cross complaints are so important, are so common. And so that is something that many feminist groups are working on, and I think that's a necessary policy intervention to make sure the wrong people aren't harmed by the institution again. But I also suggest that there have to be ways for people to come together without putting themselves at this sort of immense risk. There's this great program called Callisto. It is a tool that's become more common on college campuses that allows students to sort of file a report on this online secure database with like a time and information about what happened to them, which is also important because memory can be very affected by the trauma of these events. And you can set sort of your settings on your report to notify you if somebody else has reported the same person, and then you can be confidentially connected. We don't have that here at Harvard Law School. We don't have that in the graduate programs here, but other schools do. Stanford has been using it for years. I think it's a fantastic best practice, and this is the kind of thing that we would do if we really wanted to make sure that survivors were supported.
So we have to wrap up because another class will be coming in, but I really hope that you will continue these discussions in your networks, and I hope you'll join me in saying thank you to all of our panelists.